There was no public feud. No explosive argument caught on camera. No bitter interview. No dramatic falling out that Hollywood could point to and say, "That was the moment everything changed." For decades, Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman were connected by one film, one town, and one of the most unforgettable confrontations in Western cinema. Eastwood played William Money, an aging killer trying to live as a farmer. Hackman played Little Bill Daggett, a sheriff who believed that order was more important than mercy. On screen, they were enemies. But off-screen, the story was far more complicated than that. They were not lifelong collaborators. They did not build a 10-film partnership. They did not spend decades appearing together at premieres or giving interviews about one another. In fact, before Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman had never worked together. And that is exactly what makes their brief collaboration so fascinating. Because when Clint Eastwood finally spoke about Gene Hackman at the age of 94, he did not describe a difficult actor, a rival, or a man he merely tolerated on the set. He described something much simpler and much more meaningful. He called Hackman intense. He called him instinctive. He said there was never a false note in his work. Then Eastwood said the part that changed the way people looked back at their relationship. Gene Hackman had not merely been his co-star. He had been his dear friend. But to understand why that statement mattered, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the final scene of Unforgiven. Not to the Oscar ceremony. And not to the moment when Little Bill Daggett finally faced William Money. You have to go back to the years before the two men ever shared a screen. Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman came from completely different corners of Hollywood. Eastwood became famous through economy. Gene Hackman became famous through transformation. Eastwood's most recognizable characters often seemed to exist before the scene began. The man with no name did not explain himself. Dirty Harry did not waste words. Even when Eastwood directed, his style was built around restraint. He did not want the camera to announce itself. He did not want actors to perform simply for the sake of performing. He believed that the smallest gesture could sometimes communicate more than a page of dialogue. Hackman, on the other hand, brought a different kind of force to the screen. He could be funny, threatening, awkward, tender, bitter, or quietly broken. He did not need the audience to admire him. In many of his greatest roles, he seemed almost determined to make himself uncomfortable to watch. That was part of his power. Gene Hackman did not look like a traditional Hollywood hero. He looked like a man who had survived life rather than conquered it. His face carried pressure. His characters often seemed to be thinking faster than they were speaking. Even when he stood still, there was usually something moving underneath the surface. That quality helped make him unforgettable in Bonnie and Clyde, The French Connection, The Conversation, Superman, Mississippi Burning, and dozens of other films. His breakthrough came relatively late. He was already in his late 30s when Bonnie and Clyde turned him into a major actor. 4 years later, he won his first Academy Award for playing Detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle in The French Connection. The role was aggressive, impatient, and morally complicated. Hackman did not play Doyle as a clean hero. He played him as a man whose dedication to justice was mixed with anger, ego, and violence. That combination would become important years later when Eastwood offered him the role of Little Bill Daggett. By the early 1990s, Hackman had already spent much of his career playing corrupt officials, obsessive detectives, criminals, bullies, politicians, soldiers, and men whose power had become inseparable from their damage. Another violent Western could easily have felt like a repetition. Clint Eastwood had been developing Unforgiven for years. The screenplay, written by David Webb Peoples, had been circulating under an earlier title, The Cut-Whore Killings. Eastwood acquired the script long before he made the film, but he did not rush into production. He waited because he wanted to become old enough to play William Money. That decision was crucial. If Eastwood had made the film in his 40s, Money could have seemed like another version of the invincible Western gunfighter. But at 61, Eastwood brought something different to the role. His body looked tired. His movements were slower. His legend had become part of the story. For decades, Eastwood had represented the Western hero, the man who walks into town, faces violence, and leaves the world changed. But Unforgiven asked what happened after the legend stopped being useful. What happened to the killer after he tried to become a good man? What happened to the town after it decided that violence was the only language everyone understood? And what happened when the man everyone feared became older, weaker, and less certain of himself? Eastwood knew that the sheriff had to be more than a standard villain. Little Bill could not simply be a bad man standing between money and revenge. He had to represent the same mythology that money was trying to escape. He was a man with authority. A man who believed that control was the same thing as justice. A man who could commit terrible acts while convincing himself that he was protecting civilization. For that role, Eastwood wanted Gene Hackman. But there was a problem. Hackman was tired of violent films. In an interview preserved by the American Film Institute, Eastwood explained that he had known Hackman for many years, but the two men had never worked together before. When Eastwood sent him the script, Hackman was not immediately enthusiastic. Hackman told Eastwood that he did not want to do more violent pictures. He had been involved in too many of them and was tired of that kind of material. That reaction makes perfect sense when you look at Hackman's career. He had spent years portraying corrupt officials, obsessive detectives, criminals, bullies, politicians, soldiers, and men whose power had become inseparable from their damage. Another violent Western could easily have felt like a repetition of everything he had already done. Eastwood could have replaced him. Most directors would have. But he understood that Unforgiven was not really a film celebrating violence. It was a film questioning what violence does to people. So Eastwood asked Hackman to read the script again. He told him that if they executed the film properly, it could become a statement against violence and killing. That word, execution, was not accidental. With a story like Unforgiven, everything depended on how the violence was presented. If the beatings looked exciting, the film would glorify brutality. If the killings looked heroic, the film would become another Western fantasy. But if the violence looked painful, humiliating, and irreversible, the entire meaning of the genre could change. Hackman read the script again. Then he agreed to do it. That was the first real turning point between the two men. It was not a private argument. It was not a secret confession. It was a creative conversation. Eastwood had not convinced Hackman by promising him a bigger role or more screen time. He had convinced him that the film had something serious to say. Hackman understood that Little Bill was not just another violent man. He was a warning. From the first time audiences see Little Bill, the character is surrounded by the language of law and order. He is a sheriff. He is building a house. He wants to create something permanent. He wants to be remembered as a man who brought structure to a lawless place. But underneath that respectable identity is a deep need for control. When English Bob arrives in Big Whiskey, Little Bill does not simply arrest him. He humiliates him. He beats him. He takes away his weapons and his confidence, then turns the entire event into a lesson for the town. Little Bill wants people to believe that violence is justified when it comes from him. That is what makes the character frightening. He does not think of himself as a monster. He thinks of himself as the only adult in the room. Gene Hackman played that contradiction perfectly. He could make Little Bill seem almost reasonable in one moment and horrifying in the next. He did not shout constantly. He did not behave like a theatrical villain. He often appeared calm because, in his own mind, he was calm. The cruelty was not a breakdown. It was policy. And that made his scenes with Eastwood so powerful. William Money and Little Bill are not opposites in the simple sense. They are reflections of each other. Money has committed terrible acts and spends the film trying to escape the man he used to be. Little Bill has committed terrible acts and spends the film explaining why he was right to do so. Money feels the weight of his past. Little Bill hides behind his authority. One man is haunted by violence. The other man has made violence part of his identity. Their conflict works because both characters understand the same language. They understand fear. They understand intimidation. They understand what happens when a room becomes quiet because everyone is waiting to see who will move first. But they use that knowledge differently. Money wants to forget. Little Bill wants to control. That difference eventually destroys them both. There is an important detail in the way Eastwood approached the production. He did not try to make Hackman imitate his style. He did not ask him to become a quieter, more restrained version of himself. Instead, He allowed Hackman to bring his own instincts to the role. That was a sign of trust. Eastwood's reputation as a director was built on efficiency. He was known for preparing carefully and avoiding unnecessary delays. He did not usually surround a performance with endless explanation. He preferred actors who could arrive prepared and respond naturally when the camera started rolling. Hackman had a different kind of preparation. He was known for thinking deeply about his characters, studying their habits, and understanding the invisible history behind their behavior. That difference could have created tension. But on Unforgiven, it created texture. Eastwood gave the film its stillness. Hackman gave it instability. Eastwood's money often appears physically diminished, as if the legend has been buried under years of work and regret. Hackman's Little Bill appears solid and established, but the closer the audience looks, the more fragile that authority becomes. His confidence depends on everyone else accepting the role he has written for himself: the sheriff, the builder, the protector, and the reasonable man. When people stop believing in that role, Little Bill begins to collapse. And this is where the friendship between the actors becomes more interesting than any rumor about conflict. Actors do not have to work the same way to respect one another. Sometimes the strongest professional relationships are built between people who see the work differently. Eastwood had an instinctive understanding of the camera. Hackman had an instinctive understanding of human contradiction. Together, those instincts made Unforgiven something neither man could have created alone. Eastwood's direction prevented the film from becoming a showreel for Hackman's intensity. Hackman's performance prevented the film from becoming another quiet Eastwood Western. They needed each other's resistance. That is why the most important thing Eastwood revealed was not a secret argument. It was his recognition of Hackman's truthfulness. In 2025, after Gene Hackman died at the age of 95, Eastwood released a brief statement. It was not a long interview. It was not a detailed behind-the-scenes story. Eastwood did not invent a dramatic final conversation or claim that the two men had been inseparable for decades. He simply said that there was no finer actor than Gene. He described him as intense and instinctive. He said there was never a false note. Then he added that Hackman had been a dear friend whom he would miss very much. The statement was short. But short statements can carry enormous weight when they come from Clint Eastwood. Eastwood has never been known for over-explaining his emotions. He does not turn every relationship into a public performance. He does not need a long speech to communicate admiration. So when he used the word friend, it mattered. It told us that the silence between these men should never have been mistaken for hostility. Their friendship did not look like a typical Hollywood friendship. There were no constant public appearances. No endless interviews. No need to prove closeness to the audience. It was the kind of friendship that could exist through professional trust. Eastwood trusted Hackman to make Little Bill human. Hackman trusted Eastwood to make the film mean what the script promised. That trust is visible in the final movie. It is visible in the way Little Bill tries to explain himself even when no one believes him. It is visible in the panic that enters his voice when money returns. It is visible in the moment he realizes that authority has failed him. And it is visible in Eastwood's decision not to present Money's revenge as a triumphant return to glory. The final confrontation is not clean. It is not elegant. It is frightening and ugly. Money wins, but the victory does not restore the old mythology. He does not become a hero in the traditional sense. He becomes a man who has done something terrible and knows exactly what it cost. Little Bill loses, but the film does not reduce him to a cartoon villain. Even in defeat, he remains a man trying to tell himself a story. He was building a house. He was protecting the town. He was doing what had to be done. Those justifications are what make him recognizable. The film understands that the most dangerous people are not always the ones who know they are evil. Sometimes they are the ones who have created a moral explanation for everything they do. Gene Hackman understood that completely. And Clint Eastwood understood that Hackman was the actor who could express it without turning the character into a speech. That is the real story of what happened between them. Not hatred. Not a secret feud. Not two egos barely surviving the same production. It was a meeting between two actors who had spent their careers exploring different kinds of truth. Eastwood believed in the power of restraint. Hackman believed in the power of contradiction. Eastwood wanted the camera to catch a feeling before it disappeared. Hackman wanted the character to carry an entire life into the frame. On Unforgiven, those approaches collided. And instead of destroying the film, they gave it its identity. The result was a movie that won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Eastwood, and Best Supporting Actor for Hackman. It became one of the defining revisionist westerns of its era, a film that challenged the mythology of the American frontier rather than repeating it. For Hackman, the Oscar was another major achievement in an already extraordinary career. For Eastwood, the film became a personal reckoning with the image that had made him famous. But the most lasting achievement may have been the relationship hidden beneath the movie. Two men did not need to become identical in order to create something extraordinary. They only needed to understand what the other person could do that they could not. That is what Eastwood's later tribute revealed. He did not say Gene Hackman was easy. He did not say they approached acting in the same way. He did not claim that every moment on the set was effortless. He said something more valuable. He said Hackman was truthful. And for actors, that may be the highest compliment possible. Because an actor can be famous without being honest. An actor can be technically brilliant without making an audience feel anything. But Gene Hackman had a rare quality. Even when he played monsters, he made them feel human. Even when he played authority figures, he exposed the fear underneath their control. Even when he played a villain, he rarely seemed to be performing villainy. He seemed to be defending himself. That was Little Bill's secret. He never saw himself as the bad guy. And Gene Hackman never played him as one. Clint Eastwood saw that. He understood that Hackman's intensity was not a problem to be managed. It was the reason the character worked. It was the reason the final confrontation still feels dangerous. It was the reason Little Bill's death does not feel like the simple defeat of evil, but the collapse of a man who believed his own version of justice until the very end. So what really happened between Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman? The answer is less scandalous than the title might suggest. There was no confirmed secret feud. No verified Hollywood betrayal. No evidence that the silence between them meant hatred. What happened was that Clint Eastwood found the one actor who could turn the villain of Unforgiven into something disturbingly real. Gene Hackman found a director who understood that the film's violence had to condemn itself. They worked together once. But that one collaboration was enough to leave a permanent mark on cinema. And decades later, when Gene Hackman was gone, Eastwood finally gave the relationship its simplest description. Not business associate. Not difficult colleague. Not former rival. A dear friend. Sometimes the truth does not arrive as a shocking confession. Sometimes it arrives in a few quiet words from a man who has spent his entire life refusing to say more than necessary. There was no finer actor than Gene. Never a false note. He was also a dear friend. And perhaps that is the most honest ending this story could have. Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman did not need to look alike, act alike, or work alike. They only needed to recognize the truth in each other. And in Unforgiven, that recognition became visible on screen. One man carried the weight of what he had done. The other carried the confidence that he had done nothing wrong. Between them stood an entire history of American cinema. And when the cameras finally stopped rolling, what remained was not hatred. It was respect. It was trust. And, according to Clint Eastwood himself, friendship.